The version of World War II that most people carry in their minds is a clean one. There are the Allies, and there are the Axis powers. There are the liberators and the oppressors. There is a beginning defined by invasion, and an ending defined by surrender. And somewhere in between, the righteous prevailed. That version is not entirely false, but it is incomplete in ways that matter, and the incompleteness was not accidental. Certain facts were filed away. Certain decisions were reclassified. Certain programs were absorbed into post-war institutions so seamlessly that asking about them felt, to many people, like asking the wrong question. This narration is about the facts that were never highlighted, not because they were too complex to explain, but because explaining them would have complicated the story that governments, militaries, and historians found most useful to tell. The war lasted 6 years. It involved more than 30 countries. It produced more paperwork than any conflict in human history to that point. Requisition forms, transfer orders, medical experiment logs, bomb damage assessments, prisoner processing documents, intelligence cables, administrative memos. The war ran on paper. And what that paper recorded, in its flat and procedural language, was the systematic functioning of violence at a scale that required organization, staffing, supply chains, and routine. The most disturbing thing about World War II is not that it happened. It is that it was managed. The first fact that the post-war narrative consistently underemphasized involves the Allied bombing campaign against civilian populations in Germany. The strategic bombing of German cities was not a side effect of targeting military infrastructure. It was, at various points, the explicit objective. The British Royal Air Force, under the command of Arthur Harris, adopted a doctrine known as area bombing, which was the deliberate targeting of working-class residential neighborhoods in German industrial cities. The reasoning was administrative and economic, rather than purely military. It was believed that destroying worker housing, disrupting the daily lives of factory employees, and creating a refugee crisis inside Germany would degrade industrial output and break civilian morale. The Americans preferred what they called precision bombing, targeting factories, rail yards, and oil facilities during daylight hours. But precision, in the context of 1940s aircraft technology, was a relative term. Bombs fell where they fell. And in both the British and American campaigns, the distinction between military target and civilian neighborhood became increasingly theoretical. The city of Dresden was firebombed in February of 1945. The attack came in multiple waves. British bombers struck at night, creating fires. American bombers followed the next morning, targeting the emergency services responding to those fires. The death toll has been debated for decades. German propaganda inflated the numbers immediately after the war. Allied authorities minimized them. Independent historical research has settled on figures generally ranging between 22,000 and 25,000 dead. Dresden had limited military value at that point in the war. It was a transit hub and contained some industrial facilities, but it was also filled with refugees fleeing the Soviet advance from the east. The decision to bomb it was made at the highest levels and was the product of deliberate strategic calculation. It was not a mistake. It was a choice documented in operational orders and after-action reports. What happened in Hamburg in July and August of 1943 was even more mechanically efficient. Operation Gomorrah was a series of raids designed specifically to create a firestorm, a self-sustaining atmospheric event in which rising superheated air pulls in oxygen from surrounding areas with such force that people in the streets are pulled off their feet and incinerated or suffocate in shelters as the available oxygen is consumed. The British meteorological teams and operational planners understood, based on physics and the geometry of the city's streets and buildings, that the conditions they were creating would produce exactly this outcome. The firestorm that resulted killed somewhere between 34,000 and 40,000 people in a single night. The Hamburg raids were studied carefully by both British and American planners and were used as a template for subsequent operations. None of this was hidden from Allied governments at the time. Churchill received detailed reports. Roosevelt's administration was aware of the civilian casualty figures. The decision was made at multiple levels to continue. After the war, British Air Marshal Arthur Harris was the only senior Allied commander not awarded a peerage, a minor social consequence for a man who had overseen the deaths of hundreds of thousands of German civilians and the deaths of over 55,000 British aircrew who flew the missions. The British government did not commission a monument to Bomber Command until 2012, 67 years after the war ended, and the unveiling was met with protests from German and British citizens who felt the campaign's nature had still not been honestly addressed. The second fact involves the American internment of Japanese-American citizens. This is more widely known than some of the other subjects in this narration, but its full administrative character is rarely conveyed. After the attack on Pearl Harbor in December of 1941, the United States government issued Executive Order 9066, signed by Franklin Roosevelt, which authorized the forced relocation of any persons from designated military areas. In practice, this meant approximately 120,000 people of Japanese ancestry living on the West Coast, roughly two-thirds of whom were American citizens by birth. They were given days to dispose of their property, businesses, and possessions. They were transported to remote camps in interior states, where they lived in barracks behind barbed wire, guarded by armed soldiers, for the duration of the war. The order was implemented with bureaucratic thoroughness. The War Relocation Authority created a system of processing centers, assigned registration numbers to families, conducted loyalty questionnaires, and maintained detailed records of each internee's compliance or resistance. The questionnaires asked, among other things, whether internees were willing to serve in the United States military and whether they would forswear allegiance to the Japanese emperor. For American citizens who had never held allegiance to any foreign power, the second question was a bureaucratic absurdity. For those who answered no to both questions, a designation was created, and they were transferred to a higher security facility at Tule Lake in California. The legal challenge to the internment reached the Supreme Court in 1944 in the case of Korematsu versus United States. The court upheld the constitutionality of the exclusion orders in a 6-3 decision, with Justice Hugo Black writing the majority opinion. The decision was not formally repudiated by the Supreme Court until 2018. The property losses suffered by Japanese-American families have never been fully compensated. The Civil Liberties Act of 1988 provided $20,000 to surviving internees, a figure that bore no relationship to the actual economic damage caused by forced relocation. The program was legal, it was orderly, it was administered by professionals following procedures, and it destroyed the economic foundations of an entire ethnic community with the systematic efficiency of a government that had simply decided to do it. The third fact concerns the treatment of Soviet prisoners of war by Nazi Germany. The Geneva Conventions of 1929 established rules for the treatment of prisoners of war, including requirements for adequate food, shelter, medical care, and protection from violence. Germany had signed these conventions. When Germany invaded the Soviet Union in June of 1941, it captured an extraordinary number of Soviet soldiers in the opening months of the campaign. By the end of 1941, approximately 3 million Soviet prisoners were in German custody. By the end of the war, the total number captured exceeded 5 million. Of these, approximately 3.3 million died in German captivity, a mortality rate of roughly 60%. They died from deliberate starvation, from exposure in camps with no shelter during the Russian winter, from disease in overcrowded facilities with no medical care, and from direct execution. The German military's deliberate decision not to apply the Geneva Conventions to Soviet prisoners was made before the invasion began. It was formalized in a series of directives issued by the German High Command in the spring of 1941, including what became known as the Commissar Order, which required the summary execution of Soviet political officers captured in battle. The broader starvation policy was articulated in documents produced by German economic planning offices, which calculated that feeding Soviet prisoners would require diverting food supplies from the German civilian population and the German military, and concluded that this was not worth doing. The documentation for this decision exists in German military and economic archives. It was a policy choice, made on paper, administered through a chain of command, and executed by guards and camp administrators who processed the deaths in daily reports. The fourth fact involves the United States military's recruitment of former Nazi scientists and intelligence officers after the war under a program that became known as Operation Paperclip. The program began before the war formally ended. American intelligence teams moved through occupied Germany, identifying German scientists, engineers, and technical specialists with expertise in rocketry, aeronautics, chemical weapons, medicine, and electronics. The goal was to prevent this expertise from being acquired by the Soviet Union and to harness it for American military and scientific programs. The Office of Strategic Services, the predecessor to the Central Intelligence Agency, coordinated the effort with the Joint Intelligence Objectives Agency. The problem was that many of the most valuable German scientists had been members of the Nazi Party, the SS, or had used concentration camp prisoners as forced labor in their research facilities. Wernher von Braun, who became the central figure in the American space program and the architect of the Saturn V rocket that carried astronauts to the moon, had been a member of the Nazi Party and the SS, held the rank of Sturmbannführer, and had overseen the use of concentration camp prisoners from Dora Mittelbau in the production of V-2 rockets at an underground facility called Mittelwerk. Approximately 20,000 prisoners died at Mittelwerk from overwork, malnutrition, execution, and the physical conditions of the underground tunnels. Von Braun was aware of the conditions. He visited the facility. He selected prisoners for specific tasks. The United States military and intelligence community knew this. The Joint Chiefs of Staff had issued a policy stating that ardent Nazis were to be excluded from the program. American intelligence officers falsified and expunged the files of dozens of German recruits to remove evidence of Nazi Party membership, SS rank, and involvement in war crimes. The State Department, the Department of Justice, and the War Department all had officials who objected to the program on legal and ethical grounds. These objections were overruled. The program was classified. Von Braun became a celebrated American public figure, appeared on television programs, consulted for Walt Disney on space exploration films for children, and received the National Medal of Science from President Jimmy Carter in 1977. The fifth fact concerns the medical experiments conducted in the name of military research by the United States Army on its own soldiers and on civilian populations. The most extensively documented of these was the use of American soldiers as test subjects for the effects of mustard gas and lewisite during the war. The Chemical Warfare Service conducted experiments at facilities including Edgewood Arsenal in Maryland, the San Jose Project in Panama, and other locations. Soldiers were ordered into gas chambers, had their skin exposed to blister agents, and were required to wear clothing contaminated with chemical agents for extended periods. Many of these soldiers were recruited from minority populations, including black soldiers and Puerto Rican soldiers, in experiments that the Army internally acknowledged were designed in part to test whether different racial groups had different physiological vulnerabilities to chemical agents. The soldiers who participated in these experiments were ordered not to discuss them. Their medical records were classified. When they returned from the war and sought Veterans Administration treatment for chronic health conditions related to chemical exposure, they were denied records and often denied benefits. The existence of the program was not formally acknowledged by the Department of Defense until 1993, when the National Academy of Sciences completed a study commissioned by Congress. By that point, most of the men who had served as test subjects were dead. The sixth fact involves the scale and character of sexual violence committed by Allied soldiers during and after the liberation of Western Europe. The liberation of France, Belgium, the Netherlands, and Germany involved an enormous number of American soldiers moving through civilian populations with limited oversight and, in many areas, complete impunity. The historian Robert Lilly, in a study using military court-martial records, legal proceedings, and contemporary police reports, estimated that American soldiers committed approximately 14,000 rapes in England, France, and Germany between 1942 and 1945. The actual number is almost certainly higher, as the majority of sexual assaults were never reported to military authorities. The United States military did prosecute some cases. The court-martial records that form the basis of historical research on this subject reveal a pattern in which black soldiers were disproportionately prosecuted and disproportionately executed for crimes that white soldiers committed at comparable or higher rates. Of the 29 American soldiers executed by the military for rape or rape and murder during the war in Europe, 25 were black. The disparity was noted by some military legal officers at the time and was documented in internal reports that were not made public. The liberation narrative that shaped post-war memory of the war in Europe had no room for these records, and they remained largely inaccessible until researchers began working through military archives in the 1990s and early 2000s. The seventh fact concerns the Allied policy on Jewish refugees before and during the Holocaust. The United States, Britain, Canada, and Australia all enforced restrictive immigration policies throughout the 1930s and into the war years that effectively prevented Jewish refugees from escaping Nazi persecution in significant numbers. The Evian Conference of 1938, convened by Roosevelt and attended by representatives from 32 countries, was called specifically to address the refugee crisis created by Nazi persecution of Jews in Germany and Austria. Almost every country at the conference declined to substantially increase its refugee quotas. The United States declined to raise its existing immigration limits, which were already being administered in a way that prevented them from being filled. The State Department, under Secretary Cordell Hull and Assistant Secretary Breckinridge Long, actively obstructed Jewish immigration to the United States throughout the war. Long falsified statistics in congressional testimony about refugee admissions, issued internal directives to consular offices instructing them to find reasons to deny visas, and delayed the transmission of intelligence reports about the systematic extermination of European Jews so that they would arrive too late to affect policy decisions. The Treasury Department eventually conducted its own investigation of the State Department's conduct and produced a report in January of 1944 titled "Report to the Secretary on the Acquiescence of this Government in the Murder of the Jews." The report was blunt. It accused State Department officials of deliberate obstruction. It contributed to Roosevelt's establishment of the War Refugee Board in January of 1944, which was too late for the majority of the 6 million Jews who had already been killed. The eighth fact concerns the Soviet Union's conduct in Poland beginning in 1939. Under the terms of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact signed in August of 1939, Germany and the Soviet Union agreed to divide Poland between them following the German invasion that would begin the war. The Soviet Union invaded Poland from the east on September 17, 1939, 16 days after Germany invaded from the west. The Soviet occupation of eastern Poland involved the arrest of approximately 300,000 Polish citizens, the deportation of hundreds of thousands more to labor camps in Siberia and Kazakhstan, and the systematic targeting of Polish military officers, police officers, intellectuals, and government officials for arrest and execution. In the spring of 1940, the Soviet NKVD executed approximately 22,000 Polish prisoners, primarily officers, at sites including Katyn Forest near Smolensk and several other locations. The prisoners were shot in the back of the head, their hands bound with rope and buried in mass graves. When German forces discovered the graves at Katyn in 1943 and announced the massacre, the Allied governments, including the United States and Britain, suppressed the evidence and publicly attributed the killings to the Germans. The cover-up was a deliberate policy decision made to protect the alliance with the Soviet Union. American intelligence officers who investigated the massacre and concluded that the Soviets were responsible were ordered to suppress their findings. The Soviet Union formally acknowledged responsibility for the Katyn massacre in 1990. The ninth fact involves the experience of Black American soldiers fighting in a segregated military for a country that denied them civil rights at home. The United States Army was fully segregated during World War II. Black soldiers served in separate units, were commanded in most cases by white officers, were assigned disproportionately to service and labor roles rather than combat positions, and were denied access to facilities, recreational areas, and base amenities that were available to white soldiers. When black soldiers returned from Europe having fought in combat units, they returned to a country where they could not vote in many states, where they could be lynched without legal consequence, and where their service was not acknowledged in the same public ceremonies and commemorations as that of white veterans. The experience of the 761st Tank Battalion, the first black armored unit to enter combat in World War II, illustrates the administrative character of this inequality. The 761st was attached to General George Patton's Third Army in November of 1944 and fought continuously through 6 European countries, including the Battle of the Bulge, for 183 days. Their combat record was exceptional by any quantitative measure. Patton himself acknowledged their performance. The unit was recommended for a Presidential Unit Citation in 1945. The citation was not approved. It was not awarded until 1978, 33 years after the war ended, and after sustained lobbying by surviving members of the unit. The delay was administrative. It required paperwork to remain unfiled. It required decisions not to be made. It was, in its own way, as organized as anything else the Army did. The 10th fact concerns the destruction of Japanese cities with conventional incendiary bombs before the atomic attacks, a campaign that killed more people per raid than either atomic bomb, and that has been almost entirely eclipsed in historical memory by Hiroshima and Nagasaki. General Curtis LeMay took command of the WWII Bomber Command in the Pacific in January of 1945 and immediately changed the strategy for attacking Japan. Previous high-altitude precision bombing had been largely ineffective due to weather conditions and the dispersed nature of Japanese industry. LeMay shifted to low-altitude nighttime incendiary raids on Japanese cities, targeting the densely packed wooden residential districts where much of Japan's dispersed small-scale industrial production was concentrated. The first major raid of this campaign struck Tokyo on the night of March 9th and 10th, 1945. 334 B-29 bombers dropped approximately 2,000 tons of incendiary bombs, primarily M69 napalm canisters, on the densely populated Shitamachi district. The resulting firestorm destroyed approximately 16 square miles of the city. The official American estimate of deaths was 80,000. Japanese estimates range considerably higher, with some historical assessments concluding that the death toll exceeded 100,000, making it the single most destructive conventional air raid in history. LeMay continued the campaign against Japanese cities through the spring and summer of 1945. By the time the atomic bombs were dropped in August, the United States Army Air Forces had already destroyed, by conservative estimates, more than half of Japan's major urban areas and killed several 100,000 Japanese civilians in conventional bombing raids. LeMay later said publicly that if the United States had lost the war, he expected he would have been tried as a war criminal for the firebombing campaign. The statement was matter-of-fact. It was an assessment of the legal and moral framework that would have been applied had the outcome been different. The campaign was planned, approved, and executed within the full institutional knowledge and authority of the United States military and government. The 11th fact concerns the post-war fate of Unit 731, the Imperial Japanese Army's biological and chemical weapons research unit that conducted experiments on human subjects at a facility near Harbin in Manchuria. Unit 731 operated from 1935 to 1945. Its researchers infected prisoners with plague, cholera, typhoid, anthrax, and other diseases. They performed vivisections, amputations, and other surgical procedures without anesthesia. They exposed prisoners to extreme cold to study frostbite. They conducted pressure experiments to study the effects of rapid decompression on the human body. Estimates of the total number of people killed in Unit 731's experiments range from 3,000 to over 10,000, with the majority being Chinese civilians and prisoners of war, along with some Soviet, Korean, Mongolian, and Allied prisoners. When the war ended, American intelligence officers negotiated an agreement with the leaders of Unit 731, including its commander, Lieutenant General Shiro Ishii, under which the researchers provided their experimental data to the United States military in exchange for immunity from war crimes prosecution. The decision was made at the highest levels of the American military and government. General Douglas MacArthur, who as Supreme Commander for the Allied powers had authority over war crimes prosecutions in Japan, approved the agreement. The data from Unit 731's human experiments was incorporated into American biological weapons research programs. The researchers who had overseen the systematic torture and killing of thousands of prisoners returned to civilian life in Japan, where many became prominent medical professionals, academics, and executives in the pharmaceutical industry. None were ever prosecuted. The 12th fact involves the Allied use of German chemical weapons stockpiles found after the war and the broader Allied chemical weapons program during the war itself. Germany had developed and stockpiled nerve agents, specifically tabun and sarin, that were more lethal than anything in the Allied chemical weapons arsenal. When Allied forces overran German facilities and discovered these stockpiles in 1945, the initial military response was not simply to destroy them. American and British military researchers were intensely interested in the technical specifications, production methods, and physiological effects of the German nerve agents. German chemists and weapons researchers with expertise in nerve agent production were among those recruited under Operation Paperclip and equivalent British programs. The Allied countries had themselves maintained substantial chemical weapons stockpiles throughout the war. The United States had stockpiled mustard gas and other agents and had made operational plans for their use if Japan invaded the American mainland. British chemical weapons were used in post-war colonial conflicts in ways that were not acknowledged for decades. Many of the chemical weapons stockpiles that the Allies seized or produced during the war were disposed of by dumping them in the North Sea, the Baltic Sea, and the Atlantic Ocean, a practice that continued well into the post-war period. These underwater dumps are now corroding. The shells and containers are leaking. Fishermen in the Baltic and North Sea periodically haul up corroded artillery shells containing mustard agent in their nets. The dumps were never fully documented, and their precise locations in some areas are unknown. The 13th fact concerns the Allied strategic decision to prioritize the defeat of Germany over the rescue of Holocaust victims, a calculation that was made explicitly and documented in policy decisions throughout the war. By the summer of 1944, the Allies had detailed intelligence about the systematic extermination of Jews at Auschwitz-Birkenau and other camps. The intelligence included aerial reconnaissance photographs, escapee testimony corroborated by multiple independent sources, and reports from neutral countries whose diplomats had access to information about the deportation and killing operations. Jewish organizations and some government officials lobbied for the bombing of the rail lines leading to Auschwitz, the bombing of the crematoria, or both. The decision not to bomb was made by the Assistant Secretary of War John J. McCloy, who rejected the proposals after what internal documents describe as minimal consideration. The stated reasons were that the bombing would be ineffective, would divert resources from military operations, and might result in retaliation against prisoners. Military analysts have subsequently concluded that the practical obstacles to bombing the rail lines or the crematoria were not prohibitive. American bombers were already flying missions over the Auschwitz area, targeting the synthetic oil and rubber facilities at the adjacent Auschwitz III Monowitz complex. Aerial photographs taken on August 25, 1944, show both the Monowitz industrial complex and the Birkenau extermination camp clearly visible from the air, with the camp's gas chambers and crematoria identifiable. The decision was made with full knowledge of what the camp was and what was happening there. The 14th fact involves the scale of civilian displacement and death caused by the post-war expulsion of ethnic Germans from Eastern Europe, an event that occurred with Allied knowledge and tacit approval. The Potsdam Agreement of August 1945, signed by the United States, Britain, and the Soviet Union, included provisions for the transfer of German populations from Poland, Czechoslovakia, and Hungary to the German occupation zones. The agreement specified that the transfers should be conducted in an orderly and humane manner. They were not. Between 1945 and 1950, between 12 and 14 million ethnic Germans were expelled from Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, Yugoslavia, and the Soviet occupation zone. The expulsions involved mass violence, theft, rape, and murder. Estimates of German deaths during the expulsions range from 500,000 to 2 million, with most careful historical estimates settling on figures between 500,000 and 1 million. The expulsions were carried out by Polish, Czech, and other Eastern European governments and militaries, often with Soviet assistance or oversight. American and British occupation authorities in Germany were aware of the conditions under which the expellees were arriving, but the post-war policy framework prioritized the stabilization of the new Eastern European borders over the protection of the expelled populations. The expulsions solved a demographic and political problem created by the redrawing of European borders, and they were conducted with the efficiency of governments that had decided the problem needed to be solved. The 15th fact concerns the British use of concentration camps during the Boer War, which predates World War II, but which directly informs the institutional history of the camps that would appear in a more extreme form in Nazi Germany. The British concentration camps of the Boer War are not a World War II fact, but the concept itself and its administrative logic were part of the institutional memory of European governments and militaries entering the 20th century. What is a World War II fact is that the British government operated internment camps on the Isle of Man and elsewhere in Britain during the war, in which German and Austrian Jewish refugees, people who had fled Nazi persecution, were interned alongside actual German nationals and Nazi sympathizers, because the administrative categories used for mass internment could not efficiently distinguish between them. The classification system identified enemy aliens, and the process of determining who posed an actual security threat was slower than the process of detaining everyone who fit the demographic profile. Several hundred Jewish refugees died in British internment during the war. The 16th fact concerns the American government's deliberate decision to maintain civilian food supplies in Germany after the war, at levels that produced widespread malnutrition and some deaths among the German civilian population, as a policy choice rather than simply a logistical failure. The Joint Chiefs of Staff Directive JCS 1067, which governed American occupation policy in Germany, prohibited American occupation authorities from taking steps to maintain or strengthen the German economy. This directive was motivated in part by a broader policy framework, sometimes called the Morgenthau Plan, after Treasury Secretary Henry Morgenthau, who advocated transforming Germany into a pastoral, deindustrialized state that could never again wage industrial war. The full Morgenthau Plan was not implemented, but its influence on early occupation policy was real. The winter of 1946 to 1947 was particularly severe. German civilians in the American, British, and French occupation zones were subsisting on official caloric rations that medical authorities acknowledged were insufficient for basic nutritional requirements. Reports from American military officers in the occupation zones described widespread malnutrition and some starvation, particularly among children and the elderly. The policy was eventually revised, and the Marshall Plan, announced in 1947 and implemented beginning in 1948, represented a fundamental shift toward rebuilding the German economy. But the period between the end of the war and the implementation of the Marshall Plan involved deliberate policy choices about German civilian welfare that did not prioritize that welfare, and these choices had consequences that were documented and acknowledged within the occupation administration. The 17th fact involves the fate of Soviet citizens and Soviet prisoners of war who were repatriated to the Soviet Union at the end of the war under agreements reached at the Yalta Conference. The Yalta agreements included provisions for the mutual repatriation of nationals, which in practice meant that the Western Allies returned Soviet citizens found in Western Europe to Soviet control, including many who did not wish to return and who actively resisted repatriation. Among those returned were Soviet prisoners of war who had survived German captivity, Soviet citizens who had worked as forced labor in German factories, and members of Russian military formations that had fought alongside the Germans, including members of the Russian Liberation Army under General Andrei Vlasov. Under Stalin's orders, Soviet citizens who had been in German hands, whether as prisoners of war, forced laborers, or collaborators, were treated as suspect. Repatriated soldiers were processed by the NKVD. Many were immediately arrested and sent to the Gulag. Others were executed. The conditions of their return and their subsequent treatment were known to Allied military officers who participated in the repatriation operations. British military units in Austria used physical force to compel Cossack men, women, and children to board trains bound for Soviet custody in an operation conducted in May of 1945. The people being loaded onto those trains were not soldiers. They included entire civilian communities of Cossacks who had been living under German protection, many of whom had no personal history of collaboration, but who were being returned to a state that would treat their existence in German-controlled territory as treason. British officers present during these operations wrote accounts describing what they had participated in. Some were deeply troubled. None refused orders. The 18th fact concerns the role of IBM and other American corporations in providing the technological infrastructure that enabled the Nazi regime's administrative management of its victims. IBM's German subsidiary Deutsche Hollerith Maschinengesellschaft, known as DHOMAG, provided punch card tabulation systems to the Nazi government beginning before the war and continuing through the war years. The punch card systems were used to process the census data that identified Jews, Roma, and other targeted populations, to manage the administration of concentration camp prisoner populations, and to coordinate rail transport logistics, including the scheduling of trains to the death camps. The relationship between IBM and DHOMAG during the Nazi period, and the extent to which IBM's American headquarters maintained knowledge of and control over DHOMAG's operations after the United States entered the war, was documented extensively by historian Edwin Black in research published in 2001. IBM disputed some of Black's conclusions and characterizations. The factual core of the research, that DHOMAG's systems were used by Nazi administrative functions, including those related to the concentration camp system, and that IBM maintained a financial relationship with DHOMAG throughout the war, is established by German and American corporate and government records. Other American corporations also maintained business relationships with Nazi Germany through various financial and legal mechanisms during the war, a subject that received sustained congressional attention in the post-war years without producing significant legal consequences. The 19th fact concerns the Japanese-American soldiers of the 422nd Regimental Combat Team, not as a heroic narrative, but as an administrative fact that reveals the internal logic of the institutions that simultaneously interned their families and recruited them to fight. The 422nd was one of the most decorated units in American military history in terms of total decorations relative to size and duration of service. The soldiers of the 442nd volunteered or were drafted from the internment camps where their families were being held. They fought in Italy and France, sustained extraordinarily high casualty rates, and were used in operations that required repeated frontal assaults under conditions that produced predictably severe losses. The institutional logic here is not heroism, but administration. The army needed soldiers. The internment camps contained a population of young American men of military age. The army developed a loyalty questionnaire, sorted the respondents, and recruited from those who answered in the approved manner. The families of these soldiers remained in the camps while the soldiers fought. When soldiers of the 442nd returned to the West Coast on leave, they were in some cases subject to the exclusion orders that still applied to persons of Japanese ancestry. The bureaucratic systems that had interned their families and the bureaucratic systems that had recruited and deployed them operated simultaneously, governed by different administrative authorities without apparent awareness of the contradiction. The 20th fact involves the Allied bombing of occupied European countries, including France, Belgium, the Netherlands, and other nations that the Allies were ostensibly fighting to liberate. The bombing of German-occupied Europe was a strategic necessity in the Allied campaign, as it targeted transportation infrastructure, industrial facilities, and military installations. But it also killed substantial numbers of civilians in countries that were not the enemy. Allied bombing killed approximately 60,000 French civilians during the war. The bombing of the rail network in France in preparation for the D-Day invasion of June 1944, known as the Transportation Plan, was predicted by Allied planners to cause significant French civilian casualties, and it did. Churchill was aware of the predicted French civilian death toll from the Transportation Plan and expressed reservations in correspondence with Eisenhower. Not because the bombing was wrong, but because he was concerned about the political consequences for Anglo-French relations after the war. The operational decision proceeded after review by the British War Cabinet, which accepted the projected casualties as a necessary cost of the operational objective. The French government in exile under de Gaulle was not consulted about bombing campaigns on French territory until a relatively late stage, and their input into targeting decisions was limited. The liberation of France involved the killing of tens of thousands of French people by the forces conducting the liberation, and this fact was incorporated into the planning documents and casualty assessments of the operation without significantly altering its character. The 21st fact concerns the American military's use of napalm, which was developed during World War II for use against Japanese cities and military positions, and the institutional process by which it was normalized as a weapon. Napalm was developed at Harvard University in 1942 by a team led by chemistry professor Louis Fieser. It is an incendiary material made from naphthenic and palmitic acids mixed with gasoline, producing a substance that adheres to surfaces and burns at very high temperatures for extended periods. It was initially developed for use in incendiary bombs and flamethrowers. Its properties, specifically its tendency to stick to human skin and burn through it, were understood by its developers and by the military officers who requested its development. The weapon was tested at the WWII Proving Ground in Utah in 1943 at a facility that included full-scale replicas of German and Japanese residential buildings constructed specifically to test the effectiveness of incendiary weapons against civilian housing. Japanese residential buildings were constructed to exact specifications based on architectural surveys, and the tests were used to optimize the design and deployment of incendiary weapons for use against Japanese cities. The results of these tests informed LeMay's incendiary bombing campaign. The development of napalm, its testing against simulated civilian targets, and its operational deployment against Japanese cities were all fully documented institutional processes conducted within the normal administrative frameworks of American military research and procurement. The 22nd fact concerns the British Special Operations Executive and the Office of Strategic Services, the Allied intelligence and sabotage organizations, and their use of agents in occupied Europe whom they knowingly sent into situations with very high probabilities of capture and death. The SOE and OSS recruited, trained, and inserted agents into German-occupied France, the Netherlands, Belgium, Norway, and other countries to conduct sabotage, gather intelligence, and organize resistance networks. The agents operated under deep cover, using false identities, and lived with the constant risk of discovery by the Gestapo and German counterintelligence. In the Netherlands, the German Abwehr and SD conducted an operation known as Englandspiel, or Operation North Pole, in which captured SOE agents were used to send false radio signals back to London, allowing the Germans to receive information about planned agent insertions and capture new agents as they arrived. 54 SOE agents were captured and sent to concentration camps, where most were executed. The SOE in London received signals indicating that the agents might be compromised and continued sending agents anyway. The full extent of what London knew and when it knew it has been the subject of historical debate for decades, with documents remaining classified for years beyond the initial post-war period. What is established is that the institutional pressure to maintain active intelligence networks in occupied Europe was sufficient to override concerns about agent security that were available to decision-makers in London. The 23rd fact involves the American military government in Japan after the war and its decision to preserve the Japanese Emperor Hirohito from war crimes prosecution, a decision that shaped the entire character of post-war Japanese political culture. The International Military Tribunal for the Far East, the Tokyo equivalent of the Nuremberg trials, prosecuted 28 senior Japanese military and civilian leaders for war crimes, crimes against peace, and crimes against humanity. 7 were executed. Hirohito was not among those indicted. The decision to exempt Hirohito from prosecution was made by General MacArthur, endorsed by Washington, and motivated primarily by the calculation that the occupation of Japan would be more manageable if the emperor remained on the throne and cooperated with American authorities. The evidence that Hirohito had substantive knowledge of Japanese war crimes, including the Nanjing Massacre, the use of biological weapons by Unit 731, and the treatment of Allied prisoners of war, and that he had received detailed military briefings throughout the war, was available to the occupation authorities. Documents relating to Hirohito's wartime knowledge and decision-making were selectively controlled during the occupation. American and Japanese authorities collaborated in managing the historical record. Hirohito remained Emperor of Japan until his death in 1989. He was never required to testify before any tribunal, never required to acknowledge specific knowledge of war crimes, and his wartime role was addressed publicly in Japan only through the most carefully controlled official statements. The preservation of the imperial institution was an administrative and political decision that determined what questions could be publicly asked in Japan for decades. The 24th fact concerns the experience of German soldiers captured by the Soviet Union and held in Soviet prisoner-of-war camps. An experience symmetrical in some ways to what Soviet prisoners had suffered in German captivity, and which similarly involved systematic conditions of starvation and high mortality rates. Approximately 3 million German soldiers were captured by the Soviet Union during the war. Approximately 1 million died in Soviet captivity. The mortality rate was substantially lower than the 60% rate suffered by Soviet prisoners in German captivity, but it represented a deliberate policy choice about prisoner treatment rather than simply the result of wartime resource limitations. Soviet prisoner-of-war camps were administered by the NKVD under conditions that were harsh, with inadequate food, shelter, and medical care. Many prisoners were used as forced labor in Soviet industrial and construction projects. The last German prisoners of war were not repatriated from the Soviet Union until 1955, 10 years after the end of the war. Approximately 85,000 German soldiers who had been captured at Stalingrad were still alive in Soviet captivity in 1950. The Soviet Union did not formally acknowledge the number of German prisoners held or the conditions of their captivity for decades. The German government's attempts to account for missing soldiers continued through the Cold War period. The administrative record of Soviet prisoner-of-war policy was, like many administrative records from the Stalin period, selectively preserved and selectively destroyed. The 25th fact concerns the role of the Catholic Church, specifically the Vatican under Pope Pius V, in its response to the Holocaust. This is a subject of extensive and unresolved historical debate, with positions ranging from the view that Pius V was a calculating anti-Semite who withheld moral condemnation of the Holocaust to protect church interests, to the view that he worked within the constraints of his institutional position to save as many Jews as possible through diplomatic and practical channels. What is established by documentary evidence is that the Vatican received detailed and accurate information about the systematic extermination of European Jews from multiple sources, including its own diplomatic representatives in occupied Europe throughout the war. What is also established is that Pius XIII chose not to issue an explicit public condemnation of the extermination of the Jews by name, a decision he and his defenders attributed to concerns about German reprisals against Catholics and the Church's institutional interest in occupied Europe. The Vatican archives for the Pius XIV period were opened by Pope Francis in March of 2020. Historians who have worked through the available documents have produced a picture of an institution that was aware, that was cautious, and that made calculated decisions about what to say publicly and what to pursue through private diplomatic channels. The historical debate about whether those calculations were the best available options or represented a failure of moral leadership continues, but it is a debate about institutional decision-making and risk assessment, rather than about whether the Vatican had information or acted without regard to that information. The 26th fact concerns the way the war ended and what was carried forward from it into the institutions, alliances, and administrative frameworks of the post-war world. The Nuremberg trials established legal principles for the prosecution of crimes against humanity, crimes against peace, and war crimes. These principles were articulated clearly, prosecuted methodically, and then applied selectively. The very powers that prosecuted German leaders at Nuremberg had, as this narration has described, made decisions that occupied adjacent or overlapping moral and legal territory. The principle that aggressive war was itself a crime was established at Nuremberg and then largely set aside in the decades that followed as the post-war order was shaped by states that would conduct their own aggressive military actions under frameworks that did not apply the Nuremberg standard to themselves. The scientists who had worked on German weapons programs were absorbed into American and Soviet military research establishments. The intelligence networks that the OSS and the British services had built in occupied Europe were adapted for use in Cold War intelligence operations. Officers who had administered occupation policies in Germany were among those who designed occupation and counterinsurgency strategies in subsequent conflicts. The bureaucratic systems that had processed military procurement, prisoner registration, bombing target selection, and population transfer during the war did not dissolve when the war ended. They were reorganized, renamed, and given new mandates. The institutional knowledge of how to administer violence at scale, how to manage paperwork so that decisions remain traceable through the chain of command while responsibility remains diffuse, how to classify information so that its implications are not immediately available to the public. All of this was carried forward. The war crimes trials at Nuremberg concluded in October of 1946. The verdicts were delivered. The sentences were carried out. The tribunal was dissolved. The prosecutors returned to their governments and their careers. The defendants who were acquitted walked out of the courthouse. The defendants who received prison sentences were held in Spandau prison in Berlin. The last prisoner held at Spandau, Rudolf Hess, died there in 1987, 42 years after the war ended. The sole prisoner in a facility maintained by the four Allied powers at considerable expense for the singular purpose of keeping one elderly man confined. The prison was demolished immediately after his death. The post-war world was built on the decisions that had been made during the war, including the decisions that the post-war institutions were not designed to examine. The Marshall Plan rebuilt Western Europe. The North Atlantic Treaty Organization was established. The United Nations Charter was written. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights was adopted. These were real institutional developments with real consequences. They did not require, as a condition of their existence, that the institutions which created them account for everything that had been done in the years preceding. The accounting that did occur was selective, governed by the same calculations of interest and alliance that had governed decisions throughout the war itself. The systems that had administered the war were not dismantled. They were adapted. And the world that emerged from the war was organized by the same governments, staffed in many cases by the same people, using the same administrative logic that had made the war what it was.